So a 40k rules change today, potentially meaning that Knight Melee has just got scarier than ever. Hello and welcome back to Warspets Tactics, where today I wanted to talk about a few pretty powerful rules changes to the Imperial Knights Codex, and in particular focus on an incredibly powerful trait called Noble Combatants, which now seems to work as intended and is a very strong option indeed. Knight Melee is generally already pretty good, and the potential for getting something like an extra 50% or more damage on them is pretty nutty just for a chapter tactic type trait. We'll focus on that one to start with, talk about some of the massive damage that you might be able to get with it, and then focus on the other nightly rules from the update. So basically Games Workshop has issued the Knights FAQ Errata, and I think by far the biggest change is them fixing Noble Combatants and making it work, which was a martial tradition that you could give to Freeblade Knights, though there were a couple of different other ways that you could field it. You could just run it as an entire household, and you could also layer it onto a standard Imperialist Knight with the Master of Justice Exalted Court upgrade. It did look like one of the more obvious typos in the Imperial Knights Codex when it dropped. Previously, it was just a rule that was broken, as in it didn't work. For some reason, the rule basically excluded itself from being used on just about every weapon on the Codex, besides Titanic Feet. The updated rule, though, does work the way that I expected it to, and it basically states that when you're not using sweep attacks for a melee weapon, for every attack that either failed to hit, wound, or the enemy passed a save against, and therefore didn't reach the inflict damage step, and you get to attack all over again. Say for example your Knight Gallant got 5 attacks with that Mighty Reaper Chainsword. After the dice had finished rolling, you'd managed to punch 2 of those attacks through an enemy knight's hull, dealing 12 damage, but because 3 of those attacks had failed to inflict anything, you then get to strike another 3 times, kind of meaning that your Knight Gallant got 8 attacks for that phase, where it usually gets 5. It's a monstrously powerful boost. It's a great boost to literally any unit in the game if they can get it. The Drukhari Succubus is perhaps one of the models most famous for being able to use it, and getting this much of a raw power increase on things like Armigers or big Titanic Knights really is pretty crazy. It's not going to help you out fighting hordes or even elite infantry for the Titanic Knights. I'd say it's perhaps most effective on Armiger Warglaves, which are often going to be wanting to fight with the non-sweep attackers, that's only damage 1, maybe Knight Gallants just for the raw might, and interestingly enough the Questor Megara and friends, who Games Workshop appear to have overlooked, and it makes them one of the scariest knights with this trait. Just as an addition, before we look at some average damage, they also did add an FAQ to this one saying that it doesn't work with that Thunderstomp stratagem. That's a stratagem that deals mortal wounds on a successful hit roll, and they basically said that it doesn't stack with that, even though that attack never gets to the inflicts damage step technically. I think obviously the idea is that if you get that hit roll and it inflicts some damage, then you should probably stop, even if you haven't technically reached the inflicts damage step. Kind of makes sense there, it was a bit of a silly combo before. In any case, let's take a look at just how powerful this is. For example, an Armiger Warglaive with no external buffs like rerolls or anything, usually you get 4 strength 10 AP4 damage 3 attacks, and it's usually going to make sense to hit anything with 2 wounds or more with this profile. For example, without the Noble Combatants trait, your average expected damage output will be almost 2 Space Marines, or just over 5 wounds to a Toughness 8 vehicle. But with this crazy Noble Combatants trait, you'd average almost 3 Space Marines, or just over 8 wounds to a Toughness 8 vehicle. That shakes out to a pretty massive plus 55% damage increase, and that's just a monstrous buff for something like a chapter tactic. For example, one of the other better Imperial Knight buffs is the melee buff to House Griffith. That gives you plus 1 attack, usually a plus 25% increase, and obviously far behind that, though it does apply to sweep attacks, and that is very relevant. Otherwise, just for other examples, an Imperial Knight with the Knight Seneschal trait normally has 6 attacks at strength 16, AP 3, and damage 8. Say if it was hitting a very hard target, like an Eldar Wraith Knight maybe, something toughness 8, 5 plus invul, and minus 1 damage, you'd deal an average of 19 wounds to it normally, but with this trait you'd deal an average of 29, you're usually going to kill it. Again, that works out to be around about a 55% boost. Perhaps the single craziest thing though, and probably wasn't very intended by them, is that they seem to have forgotten about the existence of the Questor Megara. This guy's one of the Forge World Knights, is that technically that Siege Claw gets different types of attacks. It gets crush attacks and smash attacks, not sweep and strike. It means at least until they alter the FAQ to include this guy, you can technically use this on that Siege Claw smash attacks, usually giving you 12 attacks at strength 8, AP 2 and damage 3. Noble Combatants is going to work even better on this against the vast majority of targets. For example, again, if we're just taking Armour of Contempt Space Marines, you kill around about just over 3 with this, and then if you did have the Noble Combatants trait, then you kill almost 6. It winds up to be a 71% damage increase. It's pretty mental on such a threatening combat model. At least against the Space Marines, it's the equivalent of them being struck with something like 20 attacks at that Questor profile with AP 2 and damage 3. And I'm guessing that this is why they didn't really want it to apply to sweep attacks, as they thought it would probably be a bit much. Overall, the trait does look like a fun way that you could build a knight melee army around if you wanted. You could just take this as your household tradition and dispense with other things like warlord traits and relics and things. Of course, there would be downsides to passing up things like House Griffith's advance and charge warlord trait. Obviously, it's not going to be a boost against hordes in combat, so if you needed to attack with the sweep attack, then you're not gaining any bonus there. But in particular for things like Armiger Warglaves, most of the time, unless you're fighting 1 wound infantry, you do want to be attacking with the strike. It just seems very good for them all round. Well, we're on downsides though. Perhaps the other major downside is that it has to lock to Imperialis, not Mechanicus, and Mechanicus do have rather a lot of good stratagems, such as Machine Spirit Resurgent. Otherwise, I wouldn't be too surprised if they fix it for the Megara and the Styrix. It seems like a rule combination that isn't intended. For some reason, them forgetting that that model exists seems to have made it amazing for the Loyalists, but utterly rubbish for the Chaos. What's good or bad in Warhammer can be a bit funny sometimes. In general though, say if you just wanted to ally in a single knight or a squadron of warglaves, it does seem like a very tempting martial tradition to pick up for them. I think very few of them just add this amount of raw threats to your model. Otherwise, if you weren't going in on a full melee household, perhaps one of the easiest ways that you could include it would be that Master of Justice trait. Pay the points for that on the Exalted Court table, and then add this to a big knight on top of their current household tradition. So for example, you could have a Griffith's Knight with +1 attack on the charge, and then also this extra 50% or so damage from the Noble Combatants trait. It stacks up to be around just under double damage from the knight's base profile, never mind any of the other buffs that you can use with it. That combo in particular seems pretty ludicrous on a Megara. Otherwise, just to take a look at the other things from the update, there's a few other minor clarifications. Things like the Exalted Court can't take more than 1 upgrade per knight. Kind of seemed obvious from the way it was written. I don't really think anyone was taking multiple, but maybe it was technically a legal loophole. The Knight Paladin has had the AP of its chainsword amped up. For some reason in the codex it was printed at AP -2 rather than AP -3 for the rest. They've corrected the range on the thermal cannon so it's 30 inches in all cases. There were a few discrepancies. And they've clarified that Master of Law, one of the other Exalted Court upgrades, doesn't give you 2 sets of -1 damage from 2 different bondsman abilities. I don't think that this was technically a rules change. I think my reading of it would have been that you only get the -1 damage regardless of how many bondsman abilities you stack, but I guess this way there's no confusion. In any case, that Noble Combatants upgrade seems like a pretty interesting one. Let me know what you think of the crazy damage down in the comments below, and whether or not you actually think it might be worth the negatives, things like giving up other things like household, warlord traits, relics and stratagems, or not playing Mechanicus households like Tyrannus, or the support that the Mechanicus gets. In any case, if you enjoyed the video, feel free to subscribe to Allspets Tactics. I'll certainly keep the regular 40k rules updates coming. I generally try and post a video whenever Games Workshop changes the rules in a meaningful way. Finally, if you have been enjoying all the videos on the channel, I would just like to mention that Allspets Tactics does have a Patreon page, and you can find that down in the video description below. Channel patrons do get a few advantages, seeing certain videos early, regular votes to see what sort of things happen next on the channel, and automatic entry to the regular prize giveaways with a chance to win some big model kits each month. If any of that sounds good to you or you'd just like to help support, the link is down in the video description. In any case, a massive thank you for listening, and I'll hope to see you guys next time.